Food chains. Insects do not just walk on the grass. They also eat the grass. Other organisms also eat the grass, and some animals eat these insects. These interactions can be displayed by drawing a food chain. Energy and matter must always flow through an ecosystem for the system to remain stable. What exactly does this mean? Essentially, it means that organisms must eat other organisms. Food chains can be used to show eating patterns in an ecosystem. When food is eaten, energy and matter flows from one organism to another. Arrows are used in food chains to show how energy and matter flows in an ecosystem. Notice that the arrows point from the organism being eaten to the organism that eats it. For example, an arrow from a plant to a grasshopper shows that the grasshopper eats the plant. The arrow shows that energy and matter move from the plant to the grasshopper. Next, a bird might prey on the grasshopper. A snake may eat the bird, and then an owl may eat the snake. The food chain is plant, grasshopper, bird, snake, owl. Sometimes food chains can continue and become more complex, like the food chain here. Plant, grasshopper, spider, frog, lizard, fox, hawk. In an ocean ecosystem, one possible food chain might look like this: phytoplankton, krill, tuna, shark. In a food chain, some organisms are classified as producers. Producers bring energy into the ecosystem. Through photosynthesis, the producers create their own food in the form of glucose, but they also create the food for the other organisms in the ecosystem. Consumers in a food chain, such as herbivores, plant eaters, and carnivores, meat eaters, follow the producers in the food chain. When the consumers eat other organisms, they break down the glucose in those organisms to release energy through cellular respiration. In this example, phytoplankton are producers. The phytoplankton are eaten by krill, which are tiny, shrimp-like consumers. The krill are eaten by tuna, which are then eaten by sharks. So the tuna and sharks are also consumers. Decomposers are not shown in these food chains, but they are an essential component of every ecosystem. Decomposers eat dead organisms, and in doing so, they move carbon out of dead matter. Food webs. Each organism can eat and be eaten by many different types of organisms, so simple food chains are rare in nature. In ecosystems, many food chains overlap and exist together. Because feeding relationships are complex, we can combine food chains to create a more accurate flow of energy in an ecosystem. A food web shows the feeding relationships between many organisms in an ecosystem. If you expand our original example of a food chain, you could add deer that eat plants and fox that hunt snakes. A food web shows many more arrows, but still shows the flow of energy. A complete food web may show hundreds of different feeding relationships. Kelp forest food web. Kelp, sea urchins, kelp crab, sea otters, horn shark, northern elephant seals. Stop and check. What is a food chain? How is a food web different from a food chain? Using food webs. Food webs trace the path of energy in an ecosystem and can be used to tell us which organisms eats another. The food web also allows us to think about what might happen when the food for one organism runs out. For populations and organisms to be healthy, resources such as food, nutrients, water, and space must be available. What happens when there are not enough resources to support the population? Food supply and populations. Let us focus on one important resource: food. In the kelp forest food web image that was shown before, the kelp crab population eats the kelp. Let us imagine that only the kelp crabs and kelp existed in the ecosystem. If this were the case, there would be plenty of food for the kelp crabs, and they would survive and reproduce. Now, let us imagine that a sea urchin population enters the ecosystem. The sea urchins also eat the kelp. The kelp crabs now have to compete with the sea urchins for this resource. Assuming that the size of the kelp population does not increase for some other reason, the total amount of food resources for the kelp crabs will decrease. With less food, their reproduction rate and population size should decrease as well. If the population of kelp is large enough, both the kelp crab and sea urchin populations can meet their energy needs and reproduce. However, if the size of the kelp population decreases dramatically for another reason such as change in the environment, both populations could be in danger of not meeting their energy needs.